Welcome, warriors of faith. Today we step into a sacred moment, a moment where heaven listens and destiny shifts. If you have ever felt surrounded by opposition, misunderstood by people, or pressed on every side by unseen battles, then this word is for you. Because Psalm 140 is not just a chapter, it is a strategy. It is the cry of a believer who knows that God is both defender and deliverer. David did not whisper this prayer from a place of comfort. He declared it from the battlefield of life. And maybe you came here tired, maybe you came here searching, or maybe you came here believing for breakthrough. Wherever you are, I want you to lean in, because today we are not just reading scripture, we are activating it. This psalm teaches us that when words of violence rise against you, heaven releases words of authority through you. When traps are set in secret, God prepares a path in the open. And when darkness tries to define your story, the Lord Himself becomes your shield, your covering, and your justice. So before we begin, take a breath, center your spirit, and prepare your heart. Because by the end of this message, you won't just understand Psalm 140, you will learn how to pray it, speak it, and walk in the victory it promises. Justice and vindication for the faithful is not merely a hopeful idea. It is a spiritual law woven into the fabric of divine order. Psalm 140 reveals a God who does not overlook injustice, a God who hears every whispered prayer and records every hidden tear. The faithful are not promised a life free from opposition, but they are assured that opposition does not have the final word. Vindication is the moment when heaven interrupts the narrative written by adversity and replaces it with the truth spoken by God Himself. When David cried out for deliverance, he was not begging from weakness. He was invoking a covenant that declared God as defender, advocate, and righteous judge. There are seasons when faithfulness feels costly. People may misunderstand your intentions, twist your words, or attempt to trap you in situations you never created. Psalm 140 acknowledges that the faithful sometimes walk through environments filled with hostility, where the tongue becomes a weapon and deception hides behind familiar faces. Yet even in that reality, the psalmist demonstrates a posture of confidence. He does not attempt to manufacture revenge or manipulate outcomes. Instead, he positions himself under divine authority, trusting that justice belongs to the Lord. Vindication begins when the faithful release their need to control the outcome and allow God to confront what they cannot see. The language of justice in this psalm is not rooted in anger, it is rooted in alignment. The faithful cry out because they believe that righteousness matters. They believe that integrity is not wasted and that God observes every action done in secret. In a world that often celebrates quick victories gained through compromise, Psalm 140 calls believers back to a slower, deeper trust. It reminds us that divine justice may not operate on human timelines, but it always operates with divine precision. The faithful learn to wait without losing expectation, to stand without surrendering their character, and to speak truth even when lies appear louder. Vindication is also deeply connected to identity. When opposition rises, one of the enemy's first strategies is to attack how you see yourself. Accusations attempt to redefine the faithful as weak, irrelevant, or defeated. David's prayer counters that narrative by declaring God as a covering over his head in the day of battle. That covering is more than protection, it is affirmation. It is a reminder that the faithful belong to God and carry His presence wherever they go. Vindication, therefore, is not only about circumstances changing, it is about identity being restored. The faithful walk differently when they know heaven recognizes them, even when earth misjudges them. Psalm 140 teaches that God listens to the cry for justice when it comes from a heart aligned with Him. The faithful do not seek destruction for its own sake. They seek the restoration of righteousness. There is a difference between revenge and vindication. Revenge is fueled by personal pain, but vindication flows from divine purpose. The psalmist's words reveal a deep understanding that God's justice protects not only the individual but the community. When lies are exposed and wicked schemes fail, space is created for truth to flourish. The faithful become witnesses to the reality that God intervenes in ways that no human strategy could accomplish. One of the most powerful aspects of vindication is the transformation of silence into testimony. There are moments when the faithful feel unheard, when their obedience seems invisible. Yet Psalm 140 suggests that every prayer builds a spiritual record. The faithful may not see immediate results, but their words rise before God as declarations of trust. Vindication often arrives as a sudden shift, a moment when what was hidden becomes visible and what was denied becomes undeniable. It is the turning of the tide that reminds believers that God has been working behind the scenes all along. Justice for the faithful does not always mean public applause or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes vindication appears as peace that replaces anxiety, clarity that dissolves confusion, or favor that opens doors previously closed. The psalmist understands that God's justice operates on multiple levels. It can change circumstances, but it also reshapes the inner world of the believer. The faithful begin to walk with a quiet confidence, knowing that God's verdict outweighs human opinions. They stop striving to prove themselves and instead rest in the assurance that truth carries its own authority. The imagery of traps and snares in Psalm 140 reveals another dimension of vindication. The faithful are often targeted by schemes they cannot anticipate. Words spoken in secret, intentions hidden beneath polite conversations, and plans designed to cause failure become part of the spiritual landscape. Yet the psalm declares that God sees every trap before it closes. Vindication is not only about surviving the attack, it is about watching the very strategies meant for harm lose their power. The faithful discover that God's protection is not passive, it actively redirects the course of events. In the journey toward justice, patience becomes a form of worship. Waiting does not mean inactivity. It means remaining anchored in faith while God moves in ways that cannot always be measured. The faithful learn to guard their hearts from bitterness because bitterness distorts vision. David's prayer does not dwell on self-pity, it focuses on God's character. By keeping his attention on divine faithfulness, he maintains hope even when surrounded by hostility. Vindication requires this discipline of perspective, the ability to see beyond present circumstances and trust in a greater unfolding. Another dimension of justice in Psalm 140 is the exposure of false narratives. Lies often create temporary influence, but they cannot sustain themselves under the light of truth. The faithful may feel overwhelmed by rumors or misrepresentation, yet the psalm affirms that God dismantles deception. Vindication arrives when truth becomes undeniable, when the story others attempted to write is replaced by the reality God reveals. This process may be uncomfortable because exposure brings change, but it ultimately restores alignment between heaven and earth. The faithful are also invited to participate in justice through their words. David speaks with authority, declaring God's role as defender. His prayer is not passive, it is intentional. Vindication grows in environments where the faithful align their speech with God's promises. Instead of repeating accusations, they declare protection. Instead of magnifying fear, they magnify God's power. This shift in language becomes a spiritual weapon, shaping the atmosphere and reinforcing the believer's connection to divine truth. Psalm 140 portrays God as deeply attentive to the cries of the oppressed. Justice is not abstract, it is personal. The faithful are reminded that their experiences matter to God, that their struggles are seen, and that their faithfulness carries weight in the spiritual realm. Vindication often restores dignity to those who have been diminished. It lifts the faithful from positions of vulnerability into spaces of strength. This transformation is not achieved through self-promotion, but through divine intervention that elevates those who remain aligned with righteousness. The concept of justice also invites the faithful to examine their own hearts. Vindication is most powerful when it flows through vessels free from hidden compromise. David's prayer reflects humility as well as confidence. He does not claim perfection, he claims dependence on God. The faithful learn that justice begins internally, shaping their motives and refining their character. As they surrender personal agendas, they become clearer channels for God's purposes. Vindication then becomes not just a personal victory, but a testimony of God's transforming power. In seasons of waiting, the faithful may question whether justice will truly come. Psalm 140 answers that question by grounding hope in God's nature rather than circumstances. God's faithfulness does not fluctuate with human behavior, even when the path feels uncertain. The faithful can anchor themselves in the assurance that God remains attentive. Vindication is not delayed because God is absent. It unfolds according to a wisdom that sees beyond immediate outcomes. The faithful continue to pray, continue to stand, and continue to believe that righteousness is never ignored. The journey toward vindication also reshapes relationships. As God exposes what is hidden, alliances shift and priorities change. The faithful learn to rely less on human approval and more on divine affirmation. They begin to recognize that justice is not about proving others wrong, but about allowing God to reveal what is true. This perspective frees them from the exhausting cycle of defense and argument. They step into a posture of peace, knowing that God's voice carries more authority than any accusation. Psalm 140 ultimately paints a picture of a God who champions those who remain steadfast. Justice and vindication become expressions of divine love, demonstrating that faithfulness is never wasted. The faithful walk forward with renewed courage, understanding that their story is held in the hands of a righteous God. Every prayer becomes a seed planted in hope, every act of integrity a declaration that truth will prevail, every moment of trust a step closer to the revelation of God's justice in ways that transform both the visible and invisible realms. Divine protection against hidden enemies is a theme that echoes through Psalm 140 with urgency and authority. The psalmist recognizes that not every battle is visible and not every threat announces itself openly. Some adversaries move quietly through conversations, intentions, and unseen spiritual forces that attempt to disrupt peace and derail purpose. The faithful are reminded that awareness of hidden opposition is not a call to fear, but an invitation to deeper trust in God's covering. David's prayer emerges from a place of discernment, understanding that danger often hides beneath familiarity, and that true safety comes not from human vigilance alone, but from divine intervention that reaches beyond natural perception. Hidden enemies operate through subtle strategies. They may disguise themselves as friendly voices while carrying harmful intentions, or they may manifest as circumstances that quietly weaken resolve over time. Psalm 140 acknowledges the reality of whispered schemes and words sharpened like weapons, yet it does not leave the believer powerless. Instead, it introduces a posture of prayer that activates spiritual protection. When the faithful speak honestly before God about what they sense but cannot fully prove, they open the door for divine wisdom to illuminate the unseen. Protection begins with recognition, not paranoia but spiritual awareness that invites God into every hidden corner of life. The psalmist's language reveals that protection is not merely defensive, it is transformative. God does not simply block the attack. He exposes its source and neutralizes its influence. Hidden enemies lose power when brought into the light of divine truth. This is why the faithful are encouraged to remain aligned with righteousness, because integrity becomes a shield that reflects God's presence. Even when deception tries to surround them, their commitment to truth creates a boundary that opposition cannot easily cross. Divine protection is therefore both a spiritual reality and a lifestyle choice rooted in consistent devotion and trust. There is also a deep emotional dimension to facing hidden enemies. The faithful may feel confusion, isolation, or even betrayal when realizing that opposition exists where they expected support. Psalm 140 validates these emotions without allowing them to dominate the narrative. David does not deny the pain of being targeted. He channels it into prayer that strengthens rather than weakens him. Divine protection includes the healing of internal wounds caused by unseen battles. God guards not only the physical path of the believer, but also the inner world where discouragement can take root if left unchecked. The imagery of traps and snares in the psalm highlights the calculated nature of hidden opposition. Traps are designed to catch the unaware, to exploit moments of vulnerability, yet the faithful are reminded that God sees every trap before it is set. His protection operates beyond time, preparing a path of escape even before danger becomes visible. This assurance does not remove the responsibility to walk wisely, but it replaces anxiety with confidence. The believer learns to move forward without fear, trusting that God's foresight exceeds human limitations. Divine protection often manifests through subtle guidance rather than dramatic intervention. A delayed opportunity, an unexpected change of direction, or a sudden sense of caution can become expressions of God's shielding presence. The faithful begin to recognize these moments not as obstacles but as signs of divine care. Psalm 140 encourages believers to interpret their experiences through the lens of God's faithfulness rather than through suspicion or dread. Protection becomes a living relationship with God, marked by sensitivity to His voice and responsiveness to His leading. Words play a significant role in the dynamics of hidden enemies. The psalmist speaks of tongues that devise mischief and conversations that conceal harmful intent. In response, the faithful are invited to align their own speech with God's promises. Speaking truth becomes an act of resistance against deception. When believers declare God as their protector, they reinforce a spiritual atmosphere that weakens the influence of hidden opposition. Prayer transforms language from a tool of reaction into a weapon of faith, shaping reality according to divine authority. Trusting in divine protection requires surrendering the illusion of total control. Hidden enemies thrive in environments where fear dictates decisions, but faith shifts the focus toward God's sovereignty. David's prayer demonstrates a willingness to place every concern into God's hands, acknowledging that human understanding has limits. This surrender does not signify passivity, it reflects a strategic alignment with a higher power. The faithful remain vigilant in character and conduct while allowing God to manage outcomes beyond their reach. Another dimension of protection involves community. While hidden enemies may attempt to isolate the believer, divine protection often brings supportive relationships into focus. God uses people, moments, and even unexpected connections to reinforce His covering. The faithful learn to discern which voices carry life and which ones carry subtle harm. Psalm 140 encourages a posture of wisdom that values discernment without breeding suspicion. Protection is strengthened when believers surround themselves with those who reflect God's truth and encourage spiritual growth. The experience of being protected by God also reshapes identity. Instead of seeing themselves as victims of hidden opposition, the faithful begin to view themselves as individuals under divine assignment. Their confidence grows not from personal strength, but from the assurance that God is actively involved in their journey. This shift in perspective transforms how they respond to challenges. Rather than reacting with fear, they respond with prayerful authority, knowing that every step they take is covered by God's presence. Hidden enemies may attempt to create chaos, but divine protection establishes order. The psalmist's prayer reveals a God who brings clarity where confusion once reigned. As believers seek God's guidance, they begin to recognize patterns that once seemed random. They learn to trust their spiritual instincts, shaped by prayer and grounded in Scripture. Protection becomes a process of alignment, where every decision is filtered through the awareness of God's watchful care. Psalm 140 also highlights the role of humility in receiving protection. The faithful acknowledge their dependence on God, understanding that self-reliance alone cannot shield them from unseen threats. This humility opens the door for divine strength to operate fully. When believers admit their need for God's guidance, they create space for miracles that surpass human understanding. Protection becomes a partnership between divine power and human obedience, each reinforcing the other. In moments when hidden enemies appear strongest, the faithful are invited to remember God's past faithfulness. Reflection becomes a source of strength, reminding them that God has delivered them before and will do so again. This memory transforms fear into expectation, shifting focus from present uncertainty to enduring trust. Psalm 140 encourages believers to anchor themselves in the character of God, recognizing that His protection is consistent even when circumstances change. The concept of divine protection extends beyond immediate safety to include long-term purpose. Hidden enemies may attempt to delay or derail destiny, but God's covering ensures that His plans remain intact. The faithful learn that every challenge they face contributes to a larger story shaped by God's wisdom. Protection becomes a pathway toward growth, refining character and strengthening resilience. Even the presence of opposition serves to deepen the believer's reliance on God, transforming potential setbacks into opportunities for spiritual maturity. Prayer becomes the central practice through which protection is activated. David's words are not casual requests. They are declarations of trust rooted in relationship with God. The faithful are encouraged to develop a prayer life that addresses both visible and invisible battles. Through consistent communication with God, they cultivate a sense of peace that transcends external circumstances. Divine protection is experienced not only in moments of crisis, but in the quiet assurance that God remains present in every detail of life. As the believer continues to walk under God's covering, their perspective on hidden enemies begins to change. Instead of seeing opposition as a sign of failure, they recognize it as evidence of spiritual significance. The presence of hidden challenges often indicates that the believer is moving toward purpose and growth. This realization transforms fear into courage, empowering them to move forward with unwavering faith. Divine protection becomes a living testimony, revealing that God's power operates even in places where human eyes cannot see.